My name is Jada. I am 34 years old, and for the last 10 years, my family has looked at me as the ultimate cautionary tale. To them, I am the disgraced single mother who dropped out of college, a living, breathing disappointment, sitting in the shadow of my supposedly perfect sister. What they do not know is that while they pitied me, I was building an empire. I am the sole founder of a massive private equity firm. I kept my wealth entirely hidden, hoping to see who actually loved me when I had nothing. The answer was absolutely no one. The ultimate betrayal happened last week at a Michelin-starred restaurant called Le Petit in downtown Chicago. We were gathered to celebrate my father DeAndre's 60th birthday. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the private dining room, highlighting the stark divisions at our table. On one side sat my younger sister Tasha, radiating smug satisfaction next to her white husband Bradley. Bradley was the family savior, a man whose arrogance was excused because he owned luxury fitness centers. My parents, DeAndre and Yvonne, worshipped the ground Bradley walked on. To them, his whiteness and wealth elevated our family status. They fawned over his every word, laughing loudly at his jokes while ignoring the quiet 8-year-old boy sitting next to me. That boy is my son Malik. He was wearing his best button-down shirt, swinging his legs under the mahogany table, unaware that his own grandparents viewed him as a burden. The true humiliation began when the waiter approached our table with a large silver tray. The scent of seared meat filled the air. 3 Wagyu tomahawk steaks, the waiter announced, placing the plates in front of Tasha and Bradley's 3 children. The kids barely looked up from their tablets as the $120 steaks were set before them. Malik sat up straight. His dark eyes widened with excitement. He loved steak, and I had promised him a special dinner. He watched the waiter's hands waiting for his plate, but the waiter turned and walked away. Malik looked at me, confusion crossing his hopeful face. "Mommy, did they forget mine?" he whispered. Before I could motion for the waiter, Tasha reached across the table. She grabbed a wicker basket filled with cold dinner rolls and slid it forcefully until it hit Malik's water glass. "We didn't order for your son," my sister said. Her voice pierced through the quiet restaurant. She stared directly at me with a cruel smirk. "Wagyu beef is not for children who do not know how to appreciate it. Eat a breadstick, kid." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I looked at Bradley, who was casually sipping his red wine with an amused expression. "This is a joke, right?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low. "You pre-ordered luxury meals for every single grandchild at this table except mine." My father slammed his hand on the table. "Watch your tone, Jada," he snapped. "You should have packed him something from home. Bradley is generously paying for this entire birthday dinner. He should not have to subsidize your child." "Subsidize?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. "He is your grandson, Dad. It is a family dinner." My mother sighed heavily, adjusting her pearl necklace. She looked at me with that familiar blend of pity and disgust. "Do not make a scene, Jada. It is bad enough you brought him here in those cheap clothes. We know being a single mother is difficult, but Bradley works hard for his money. He has a massive business empire to run. He cannot be expected to throw his cash away on charity cases." I looked at the people who shared my blood. I saw the absolute contempt in my mother's eyes, the dismissive anger in my father's posture, the triumphant gleam on Tasha's face, and the blatant, arrogant racism hiding behind Bradley's polished smile. They genuinely believed I was beneath them. They truly thought I was a broke, helpless failure who had to sit there and swallow their abuse. Bradley set his wineglass down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at Malik, then at me, dripping with condescension. "Listen, Jada. I know times are tough for you. If you are really strapped for cash, I can tell the kitchen to boil up a plate of cheap buttered noodles for the boy. I will cover it. Call it my good deed for the month, but you need to teach him his place." I looked down at Malik. His eyes were swimming with tears he was bravely trying to hold back. He stared at the cold, hard bread roll in front of him, his little shoulders slumped in defeat. That was the exact moment the last thread of my familial loyalty snapped. I had spent years hiding my success to protect their egos, hoping they would eventually love me for me. But seeing them deliberately starve and humiliate an 8-year-old boy just to make a point changed everything. I did not cry. I did not yell. I took a deep, calming breath. I looked straight into Bradley's arrogant blue eyes, then at my sister, and finally at the parents who had failed me. Noted, I said softly. I squeezed my son's hand, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. Do not worry, baby. You are about to have the best meal in this entire city. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the front of my dress. The time for hiding was over. The time for playing the helpless, disgraced daughter was completely done. I raised my hand and signaled for the general manager. It was time to show this family exactly who they were dealing with and exactly whose world they were living in. I was ready to take back control of my own life. Today. Bradley chuckled, swirling his vintage Bordeaux, fully expecting me to lower my head and whisper a pathetic word of gratitude. He wanted me to thank him for offering my son a $10 plate of boiled pasta, while his own children gorged themselves on premium cuts of meat. My mother Yvonne crossed her arms, waiting for my submission. My father DeAndre let out a harsh breath, clearly annoyed that my hesitation was delaying his birthday toast. They all thrived on this abusive power dynamic. They fed on my supposed misery. I gently placed my linen napkin on the table and turned my full attention to my white brother-in-law. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a sharp curve of the lips that made Tasha shift uncomfortably in her upholstered chair. She was not used to this quiet, unyielding confidence. Noted, I said softly. The single word hung in the air, crisp and definitive. Bradley's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. He clearly had not anticipated such a calm, unaffected response. He opened his mouth, likely to deliver another condescending remark about my financial status, but I did not give him the floor. I raised my right hand, snapping my fingers just once. The sound was sharp, cutting effortlessly through the ambient noise of the private dining room. My father's face flushed with immediate outrage. "What do you think you are doing?" he hissed. "You do not snap at the waitstaff in a place like this. You are going to get us thrown out, Jada. Lower your hand right now before you embarrass me further." I ignored him completely. Within seconds of my gesture, the heavy mahogany doors of our private room swung open. It was not a regular server who entered. It was Antoine, the regional general manager of the entire restaurant group. He bypassed my father, ignored Bradley's raised hand, and walked directly to my side of the table. He bowed his head with genuine practiced reverence. "Ms. Davis," Antoine said, his voice laced with the utmost respect. "I apologize for any delay. Is there an issue with the service this evening? How may I assist you?" The absolute silence that crashed down over the table was deafening. Tasha's mouth literally dropped open in sheer bewilderment. My mother pulled back her eyes, darting frantically between Antoine and me. DeAndre froze, his angry reprimand dying in his throat. Bradley simply stared, his pale face suddenly looking incredibly foolish. Why was the general manager of a world-renowned steakhouse addressing the family scapegoat? With such profound deference, I kept my posture perfectly straight. "Antoine, there has been a slight misunderstanding regarding our order," I said smoothly, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "My son has not been served his main course. Please bring Malik the chef's exclusive tasting menu, the full 7 courses." Tasha practically choked on her own saliva. "Are you insane?" she shrieked. "That tasting menu is $500. Bradley is absolutely not paying for that. Tell him to cancel it right now, Bradley." Bradley puffed out his chest, attempting to regain control. "Look here, buddy," he said to Antoine. "I am footing the bill for this table, and I explicitly forbid you to bring that food to the kid. Cancel her order immediately. Bring him the cheap pasta like I said." Antoine did not even flinch. He did not look at Bradley. He kept his respectful gaze fixed entirely on me, awaiting my confirmation. "The chef's tasting menu," I repeated clearly, turning to look at my son. Malik's eyes were huge, shining with sudden awe. "You are going to have the butter-poached lobster tail, baby," I told him, "followed by the truffle risotto, the seared scallops, and your very own gold leaf chocolate dessert. Only the best for you." Malik grinned, his earlier entirely evaporating. "Thank you, Mommy," he cheered. I looked back at Antoine. And please ensure the pacing matches the rest of the table so my son does not have to wait a second longer. Right away, Ms. Davis. The kitchen will prioritize his courses immediately, Antoine replied, bowing his head once more. Bradley's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. Are you deaf? He shouted at the manager. I said I am not paying for it. If you bring that food out, I am disputing the entire charge. You are making a massive mistake listening to her. She is a broke single mother who cannot even afford the shoes on her feet. I let out a soft melodic laugh. The sound sent a visible shiver down my sister's spine. Do not worry, Antoine, I said, finally turning my gaze back to the man who had tormented me all evening. You will split the check tonight. Bring me the bill for my son's tasting menu, my own dinner, and our beverages. I will settle that separately. Oh, sure, with what? Tasha mocked. Are you going to wash dishes in the back to pay for a $500 dinner? You are humiliating yourself, Jada. Stop pretending. Actually, Tasha, I am just getting started, I replied, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal register. I looked directly into my father's shocked eyes, then back to the manager. Antoine, please listen carefully. The gentleman in the gray suit is planning to pay for the remaining guests using a black-tier VIP corporate discount card. Bradley puffed out his chest again. That is right, a 50% discount. Perks of being a high-level executive. I smiled. The card he is holding is registered to Apex Holdings. I am the CEO of Apex Holdings. I am declaring that card unauthorized. Revoke the discount immediately. Cancel their privileges permanently. The real dinner was finally being served tonight by me. Let the games officially begin right now, my dear family. Antoine executed my command immediately, stepping backward with a respectful bow before turning to the kitchen. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, leaving behind a suffocating heavy silence inside our private dining room. My father looked as if he had just been slapped across the face. My mother sat entirely frozen, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the white tablecloth. Tasha kept blinking rapidly, completely unable to process how the sister she had mocked and belittled for years was suddenly commanding the general manager of a five-star restaurant. Bradley, however, was stubbornly clinging to his manufactured pride. He scoffed loudly, adjusting his expensive tailored tie, and pulled a sleek platinum credit card from his designer leather wallet. He tossed the card onto the center of the table with an arrogant, dismissive flick of his wrist. This is absolutely ridiculous, Bradley sneered, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably to hide the slight nervous tremor in his voice. She is obviously bluffing to save face. There is absolutely no way she owns a company like Apex Holdings. She probably slept with someone to get a fake corporate card. Just run my platinum card when the bill comes. I am not letting some delusional single mother ruin our night out. I did not bother correcting him. I just poured myself a glass of sparkling water and turned my attention completely to Malik. Within minutes, a team of professional waiters arrived. They placed a magnificent lobster tail in front of my son. Malik dug in with pure joy, completely oblivious to the radioactive tension radiating from his grandparents and his aunt. When the main courses were cleared and the final dessert plates were pushed aside, the head waiter approached our table holding a black leather folio. He bypassed Bradley entirely and walked straight to my side of the table. I gently tapped the leather folio. Present the check to the gentleman in the gray suit, I instructed calmly, pointing a manicured finger at Bradley. As agreed, he is covering the $3,500 for his party. My son and I have already been taken care of. The waiter nodded, pivoting smoothly to hand the folio to Bradley. Bradley snatched it out of the waiter's hands, glaring at me with pure, unfiltered venom. He opened the leather booklet, pulled out his platinum card, and shoved it onto the silver tray. Run it, Bradley barked aggressively. And bring me a pen immediately. We are leaving this instant. The waiter stepped back, pulling a handheld wireless payment terminal from his apron pocket. He inserted the platinum card into the slot. We all sat in absolute silence, waiting. A loud, sharp beep echoed through the private dining room. The digital screen flashed a bright red warning light. I am terribly sorry, sir, the waiter said, his voice perfectly polite but loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. This card has been declined. Tasha gasped loudly. Declined, that is completely impossible. Try it again right now. It must be a machine error. Bradley makes millions of dollars. Of course it is an error. Bradley snapped, his pale face suddenly flushing with a deep, ugly shade of crimson. He snatched the card back from the waiter and fumbled nervously through his wallet, pulling out a heavy metal rewards card. Run this one. The bank probably flagged the other one for fraud protection because of the unusually high amount. It happens all the time when you spend as much money as I do. The waiter inserted the second card into the machine. Another sharp, embarrassing beep filled the room. The screen flashed red again. Declined. My mother let out a small, horrified squeak. She looked around nervously, terrified that the wealthy diners sitting outside our private room might hear the commotion. My father gripped the edge of the table, his eyes locked intensely on the payment terminal. Bradley, what exactly is going on here? DeAndre demanded, his voice tight with rising panic and confusion. Why are your credit cards bouncing? It is just a bank glitch, DeAndre. Bradley growled, sweat beginning to bead heavily on his forehead. His confident, arrogant demeanor was rapidly melting away, exposing the frantic, cornered man underneath the expensive suit. He pulled out a third card, his hands visibly shaking now. Run this one, now. The waiter complied without a word. Beep, declined. Antoine stepped smoothly into the room. He stood tall, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. Our machines are working perfectly, sir, Antoine said coldly, glaring down at Bradley. We have attempted to process 3 different cards. All of them have been declined due to insufficient funds or exceeded credit limits. The total bill is $3,500. How will you be settling this balance tonight? I do not care where you live, ma'am, Antoine continued, interrupting Tasha's excuses. If you cannot provide a valid form of payment immediately, I will be forced to contact the Chicago Police Department to resolve this matter. We do not tolerate theft of services here. The word police hit the table like a physical blow. My mother covered her face with her hands, letting out a stifled sob of absolute mortification. DeAndre, do something quickly. Yvonne hissed at my father, tears of embarrassment welling in her eyes. We cannot get arrested. The church congregation will find out. Our reputation will be completely ruined. Bradley was hyperventilating. He looked at my father with wide, desperate eyes. DeAndre, spot me. I will wire you the funds tomorrow morning. I swear on my life. I watched my father's face crumple. He did not have the cash. I watched him log into his banking app. He navigated to his retirement portal, draining his hard-earned savings and incurring massive penalties just to cover the bill for a man who had belittled his own grandson. I am transferring the money now, my father mumbled brokenly. The grand, pathetic illusion was finally shattering completely tonight. The heavy glass doors of Le Petit slammed shut behind us, cutting off the warm, ambient music of the restaurant and plunging us into the freezing Chicago night. The valet parking lot was dimly lit, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. I held Malik's small, warm hand securely in mine, guiding him toward my unassuming sedan. My son was happily humming, his stomach full of premium lobster and chocolate, completely shielded from the venomous glares boring into the back of my head. I opened the rear door, helped him into his booster seat, and handed him his tablet with his noise-canceling headphones. I needed him entirely distracted. The storm that had been brewing inside the private dining room was about to unleash its full fury out here in the cold. Before I could even close my driver's side door, Tasha marched across the asphalt, her high heels clicking aggressively against the ground. She grabbed the edge of my car door, pushing it wide open to trap me against the frame. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You vicious, jealous witch!" Tasha spat, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Are you happy now? Did you get exactly what you wanted? You just humiliated my husband in front of half of downtown Chicago. You forced Dad to drain his retirement account just to prove some sick, twisted point about a stupid plate of food." I looked at my sister, feeling nothing but a profound, icy calm. "I did not force Dad to do anything, Tasha. Your wealthy, successful husband ordered food he could not pay for. I simply refused to be his scapegoat. If his credit cards are bouncing like rubber balls, that is your problem, not mine." My mother, Yvonne, rushed over, pulling her fur coat tightly around her shoulders. She looked absolutely devastated, acting as if I had just committed a violent crime against the family legacy. Jada, how could you be so incredibly vindictive? She cried, pointing an accusing finger at my face. Bradley is family. He has brought nothing but prestige and honor to us. You deliberately embarrassed him because you resent his success. You are so bitter about your own failed life that you had to ruin a beautiful celebration. My father stood a few paces behind them, his shoulders slumped, staring at the receipt in his hand as if it were a death sentence. The illusion of Bradley's vast wealth had been the pillar holding up my parents' fragile egos, and I had just kicked that pillar out from under them. Bradley finally approached, flanked by the valet bringing around his shiny Mercedes. He looked humiliated, but his arrogance was rapidly reasserting itself as a defense mechanism. He scoffed, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. Do not worry about it, Yvonne, Bradley sneered, adjusting his expensive jacket. She is just petty. Let her enjoy her little restaurant stunt. She will be back to washing dishes and begging for handouts by next week. Tasha nodded vigorously, stepping closer to me, her eyes flashing with a desperate need to defend her husband's crumbling facade. Exactly. Bradley is a visionary. He is expanding his luxury fitness empire across the entire Midwest. You think a bounced credit card means anything. It is just a temporary cash flow issue because his capital is tied up in massive investments. You do not understand how real business works, Jada. Mom and Dad understand. That is exactly why they remortgaged the historic brownstone to loan Bradley $500,000. They know a guaranteed return on investment when they see one. The words hung in the freezing air. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. Tasha immediately slapped her hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in sheer panic. She had slipped. In her desperate, pathetic attempt to prove her husband's financial superiority, she had accidentally exposed the family's most guarded secret. My mother gasped, taking a sudden step backward. My father's head snapped up, his eyes darting frantically toward the pavement. Bradley cursed under his breath, glaring at his wife with pure hatred. I stood frozen against my car. The cold night air suddenly felt like a physical blow to my chest. I stared at my father, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal I had just uncovered. The historic brownstone was our family's legacy. It had been passed down from my great-grandparents, fully paid off, a symbol of Black resilience and generational wealth. And they had secretly put it on the line for this arrogant racist fraud. You remortgaged the family home, I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. I stepped away from the car, closing the distance between my father and me. You took out a $500,000 loan on our ancestral home to hand the cash to him. My father refused to meet my eyes. He looked at the asphalt, shifting his weight uncomfortably. It is a secured business loan, Jada. Bradley is paying us interest. It is none of your concern how I manage my property. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed across the empty parking lot. None of my concern. 10 years ago, my son was lying in a hospital bed with a severe lung infection. I was working 3 jobs just to keep the heat on. I came to your house, fell on my knees in your living room, and begged you for a $2,000 loan to cover Malik's medical bills. Do you remember what you told me, Dad? DeAndre remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. You told me no, I said, my voice rising, fueled by agony. You looked at my sick child and told me that I was an irresponsible single mother. You said bailing me out would only encourage my bad decisions. I turned to my mother. You let me sell my own blood plasma just to survive. My mother physically recoiled from my words, pulling her expensive fur coat tighter against her neck as if the truth could somehow give her frostbite. She refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at the wet pavement, while a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the valet parking lot. DeAndre shifted his weight, crossing his arms defensively over his chest. He was desperately searching for a way to justify his past cruelty, grasping for the familiar narrative where he was the wise patriarch and I was the reckless failure. He opened his mouth to deliver another lecture on his tough love. Before my father could speak a single syllable, Bradley let out a loud, theatrical groan of profound annoyance. He was entirely uninterested in our family history, completely detached from the pain they had inflicted upon me and my son. To him, my struggles were nothing more than a boring interruption to his own self-important drama. He adjusted the lapels of his designer suit and leaned casually against the sleek, polished hood of his silver Mercedes. It was a leased vehicle, a fact I knew because true wealth rarely felt the desperate need to show off so aggressively in public. "Are we quite finished with this pathetic sob story?" Bradley sneered, checking his diamond-encrusted watch with an exaggerated sigh. "Because it is freezing out here and I have actual business to attend to. I do not have time to stand in a parking lot, listening to a bitter woman complain about the consequences of her own poor life choices. You chose to have a kid you could not afford, Jada. That is your problem, not ours. And despite your little stunt inside the restaurant tonight, nothing has changed about the reality of our respective positions in this world." Tasha moved to stand proudly beside her husband, linking her arm through his and glaring at me with absolute contempt. She nodded in furious agreement, emboldened by his blatant disrespect toward me. Bradley smirked, clearly enjoying the blind adoration he received from my sister and my parents. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, stepping away from his car to close the distance between us. He wanted to make sure I heard every single word he was about to say. He wanted to ensure his threat struck absolute terror into my heart. He wanted me completely broken. "You think you won a minor victory tonight, just because I had a temporary issue with my bank accounts," Bradley said, his voice dripping with venomous arrogance. "But you are playing a game you cannot possibly understand. You have absolutely no idea what kind of power I am dealing with. In exactly 2 weeks, I have a scheduled meeting that is going to make your entire existence look like a joke. I am pitching a $5 million expansion plan for my luxury fitness franchise to the most prestigious venture capital firm in this city, Apex Capital." He paused, letting the name of the firm hang heavily in the freezing night air, expecting me to cower at the mere mention of such immense wealth. "They only deal with the absolute elite," Bradley continued, his chest puffing out with unwarranted pride. "They are going to fund my national expansion, and I am going to walk out of their high-security glass boardroom with $5 million in funding. And do you want to know what the very first thing I am going to do with all that newly acquired wealth will be, Jada?" I stood perfectly still, maintaining a blank, unreadable expression as I stared back into his hostile blue eyes. "I am going to buy the miserable, run-down apartment building where you and your son live." Bradley snarled, his lips curling into a vicious, malicious grin. "I am going to purchase the entire property through a shell company, and then I am going to personally serve you with a 30-day eviction notice. I will throw your belongings onto the sidewalk myself. I will make sure you are living on the streets to finally teach you some basic respect." Tasha let out a sharp, breathless laugh, thoroughly delighted by the prospect of my impending homelessness. My parents said absolutely nothing to defend me. They did not reprimand Bradley for threatening to throw their own grandson out into the freezing Chicago winter. They simply stood there silently endorsing his cruelty, because his promised $5 million valuation validated their decision to remortgage their ancestral home. They had bet their entire legacy on this arrogant man, and they were perfectly willing to let me be destroyed, just to ensure their precious golden child remained comfortably seated at the very top. "We are leaving," Bradley announced briskly, turning his back on me with ultimate disdain. He opened the passenger door for Tasha, who shot me one final triumphant glare before sliding into the luxurious leather seat. My parents hurried toward their own sedan, eager to escape the suffocating tension of the parking lot. DeAndre refused to look in my direction. Yvonne kept her head bowed down. They were choosing their side, walking away from my son and me, just as they had done for my entire life. The Mercedes engine roared to life, its bright headlights piercing the darkness. Bradley aggressively slammed the car into gear and sped out of the valet lot, his tires screeching loudly against the damp pavement. I watched the red taillights of their vehicles disappear into the heavy city traffic, leaving Malik and me, standing alone in the quiet, bitter cold. I looked down at my sweet, innocent son, who was safely distracted by his glowing tablet screen, completely oblivious to the vicious threats that had just been hurled at our family. I slowly looked back up at the empty street, watching the exhaust fumes dissipate into the dark, freezing night sky. They had absolutely no idea that Apex Capital was my own stealth venture firm. The trap was set. The heavy frosted glass doors of the Apex Capital boardroom swung open with a soft, authoritative click. For the past 20 minutes, Bradley, Tasha, DeAndre, and Yvonne had been sitting in the luxurious space, loudly bragging about the millions they were about to secure and laughing about my impending eviction. Their arrogant voices echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling Chicago skyline. They were completely unaware that the very foundation of their false reality was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I stepped across the threshold, feeling a profound, icy calm radiate through my veins. I wore a tailored dark charcoal power suit that fit impeccably, paired with a crisp white silk blouse and black stilettos that announced my arrival with a sharp rhythmic tapping against the polished hardwood floor. Behind me, my elite legal team filed into the room in perfect synchronization. There were four of them carrying thick leather briefcases and exuding the kind of intimidating corporate professionalism that commanded immediate respect. We moved as a unified front, a silent, unstoppable force, entering the arena. The sudden influx of people caused the loud, boastful conversation at the long mahogany table to grind to a sudden, awkward halt. Bradley was leaning far back in one of the plush executive chairs, his feet practically resting on the expensive table. He did not even bother to look up properly when we entered the room. He simply saw a black woman in a suit leading a group of professionals and instantly relied on his deeply ingrained racist assumptions. He snapped his fingers in the air, a sharp, disrespectful sound that perfectly mirrored his behavior at the restaurant 2 weeks prior. "It is about time someone showed up," Bradley barked, checking his diamond watch with an exaggerated sigh of profound annoyance. "Listen, sweetheart, the CEO is supposed to be here any minute to hear my $5 million pitch. We have been waiting long enough. Be a good girl and run down to the kitchen to fetch us some coffees. I take mine black and make sure Tasha gets her latte with almond milk. Hurry it up before the real executives arrive and see how terrible this firm's hospitality is." Tasha let out a sharp, condescending laugh, crossing her arms over her designer blouse. "Honestly, the service here is surprisingly slow." My sister chimed in, glaring at me without actually recognizing my face in the dim, dramatic lighting of the entrance. "Make sure the coffee is hot, and grab some sparkling water for my parents while you are at it." DeAndre and Yvonne nodded in agreement, sitting stiffly in their chairs, desperately trying to project an aura of generational wealth that they absolutely did not possess. They were entirely oblivious to the identity of the woman standing just a few feet away from them. I did not blink. I did not pause my confident stride. I completely ignored Bradley's snapping fingers and Tasha's arrogant demands. I continued walking deliberately toward the head of the massive boardroom table. My legal team dispersed seamlessly, taking their designated positions along the side of the room, opening their briefcases and withdrawing thick stacks of financial documents. The synchronized, highly professional movements of my lawyers finally caught Bradley's attention. He lowered his feet to the floor, sitting up straighter, a flicker of confusion crossing his pale face. He squinted at me as I approached the massive, high-backed leather chair reserved exclusively for the founder of the firm. I placed my hands on the smooth leather armrests, pulled the heavy chair out, and gracefully sat down at the very head of the table. I folded my hands neatly in front of me, resting them on the polished mahogany surface. I reached out and pressed a small silver button embedded in the console. The heavy motorized blackout blinds slowly descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into a cool, professional darkness. Simultaneously, a massive projector screen lowered from the ceiling directly behind my chair. The high-definition projector hummed to life, casting a bright, crisp image across the room. The sleek, imposing logo of Apex Capital illuminated the screen in bold silver lettering, framing my silhouette perfectly. The brilliant light from the projector finally illuminated my face completely. I looked directly across the length of this table, making unbreakable eye contact with the man who had threatened to throw my son onto the street. "Good morning, Bradley," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and echoing with absolute authority in the enclosed space. "I do not fetch coffee for anyone. My name is Jada Davis. I am the founder, the primary shareholder, and the chief executive officer of Apex Capital. Welcome to my firm." The collective shock that crashed down upon my family created a paralyzing, breathless silence in the room. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the atmosphere. Tasha's mouth dropped open so wide her jaw practically unhinged. She stared at me, her eyes bulging with a mixture of sheer terror and complete incomprehension. The arrogant smirk vanished from Bradley's face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. His pale skin drained of all color, turning a sickly, ghostly shade of white as the devastating reality of his situation violently slammed into him. DeAndre and Yvonne sat entirely frozen, paralyzed, like statues carved from cheap stone. My mother's hands began to visibly tremble against the tabletop, her knuckles turning white. My father's breath hitched in his throat, a pathetic, strangled, gasping sound escaping his lips. They were staring at the daughter they had discarded, the single mother they had mercilessly humiliated, now sitting on a throne of undeniable corporate power. The illusion of Bradley's supremacy had shattered, leaving them trapped inside the glass walls of my empire, completely at my mercy. This was the exact moment they realized their monumental mistake. The beautiful, agonizing truth was that they could not escape it. Bradley was the first to break the heavy silence. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded more like a choke. "This is a joke," he stammered, looking around the massive room as if searching for hidden cameras. "You hacked their system. You rented this boardroom to pull some elaborate psychotic prank on us to get back at me for the restaurant." I did not even dignify his desperate delusion with a direct response. I simply nodded to my lead acquisitions attorney, Marcus, who was standing quietly by the wall. Marcus tapped his tablet, and the massive screen behind me transitioned instantly from the Apex Capital logo to the exact title slide of the pitch deck Bradley had submitted to my firm 2 weeks ago. Bradley's elite fitness empire, a blueprint for national expansion. The bold, arrogant font hovered over all of us like a looming storm cloud. "You are asking my firm for $5 million, I stated, leaning back in my heavy leather chair and steepling my fingers together. "In your prospectus, you claim your current 3 gym locations in the greater Chicago area are operating at a 20% profit margin. You project that an injection of $5 million will allow you to open 10 new locations across the Midwest within 18 months. You presented yourself to my acquisitions team as a visionary entrepreneur, ready to scale a proven, highly lucrative business model." Tasha found her voice, though it trembled violently. "Because he is a visionary," she shrieked, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. "He is expanding. You have no right to look at his private business documents, Jada. This is illegal. We are going to sue you for corporate espionage. When you submit your company for venture capital funding, your financials cease to be private, Tasha." I explained, keeping my tone strictly educational, as if speaking to a slow, misguided child. Apex Capital employs some of the most ruthless forensic accountants in the country. We do not write $5 million checks based on flashy PowerPoint slides and unwarranted white male confidence. We conduct deep, exhaustive due diligence. I pressed the sleek remote in my hand. The screen changed with a sharp click. "And your husband's due diligence report is the most entertaining piece of fiction my team has read all year long." The slide now displayed a complex series of red graphs pointing drastically downward, overlaid with high-resolution scans of official legal notices. DeAndre and Yvonne leaned forward, squinting at the glowing screen, their faces contorting in profound confusion and growing dread. "Let us perform a little financial autopsy, shall we?" I asked, standing up and slowly pacing down the side of the mahogany table. "Your 3 existing luxury gyms are not operating at a 20% profit margin, Bradley. In fact, they are hemorrhaging money at an unprecedented rate. Your flagship location in River North is currently 3 months behind on rent. I have the commercial eviction notices right here." I tapped the screen with my finger. "Your second location had its premium equipment repossessed last Tuesday because you defaulted on the vendor financing agreements. And your third location, you have not paid your staff payroll in 3 weeks. You are currently facing 2 separate class action lawsuits from your own employees." Bradley was sweating profusely. He gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Those are temporary cash flow bottlenecks," he argued, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "The fitness industry is highly seasonal. The $5 million will bridge the gap and trigger the rapid expansion phase." "You do not have an expansion phase," I corrected him sharply, my voice echoing in the large room. "You are functionally bankrupt. You came to my firm hoping to secure $5 million so you could use the capital to secretly pay off your outstanding business debts, not to open new locations. That is classified as investor fraud, Bradley, and it carries a heavy prison sentence." I clicked the remote again. A collage of colorful photographs filled the screen. There was the silver Mercedes he had driven away from the restaurant. There was Tasha's massive diamond engagement ring. There were pictures from their social media showing them vacationing on chartered yachts in Miami. "You have sold my parents a beautiful, flawless illusion of elite wealth." I continued, making direct eye contact with my mother, whose lips were visibly trembling. "But the reality is entirely built on leased luxury and maxed out credit lines. That silver Mercedes leased and currently in default. The leasing company has already issued a repossession order. Your exclusive country club membership, suspended for non-payment 6 months ago. Even the designer clothes you and Tasha are wearing right now were purchased on credit cards that are currently in severe collections." "Shut up!" Bradley yelled wildly, slamming his fist down hard on the table. "You have no right to discuss my personal life." "I have every right when you try to defraud my company." I fired back, my voice rising with undeniable authority. "But the absolute worst part of your pathetic scheme is not what you tried to steal from me, it is what you actually stole from them." I pointed directly at DeAndre and Yvonne. My parents looked absolutely terrified. I pressed the button for the final slide. A high-resolution scan of a bank transfer receipt appeared on the screen. It showed exactly $500,000 moving from my parents' joint account into Bradley's personal checking account. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice softening slightly, though the underlying edge remained razor-sharp. "You remortgaged the historic brownstone, a property our family worked for generations to own free and clear. You handed this man $500,000 because he convinced you it was a secured business loan to save his gyms." My father nodded frantically, beads of sweat rolling down his wrinkled forehead. "It is secured," DeAndre insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He showed me the business projections. He is paying us interest every single month." "He is paying you back with your own money," I revealed, delivering the fatal, crushing blow. "My forensic accountants tracked every single cent of that $500,000. Bradley did not put a single dime of your money into his failing gyms. Do you want to know exactly where your precious family legacy went?" I pointed to the itemized list appearing next to the bank receipt on the glowing screen. $200,000 went immediately to an offshore online gambling syndicate to cover his massive sports betting debts. $100,000 went to paying off the overdue lease on his fake luxury cars and covering Tasha's ridiculous shopping sprees so they could maintain the illusion of being rich. The rest has been slowly trickling out to keep up the minimum payments on his personal credit cards. Your $500,000 is entirely gone, Dad. He burned it to the ground just to look rich." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. DeAndre sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the banking receipt projected on the massive screen. He had traded the historic home built by his own grandfather for a gambler's lies. Yvonne buried her face in her hands, letting out a sharp, devastated wail. She looked at Bradley, waiting for him to deny it, to provide some magical explanation that would restore his status as the perfect son-in-law. But Bradley did not offer comfort. He did not apologize. The realization that he was completely trapped, that his multi-million-dollar venture capital pitch was actually a meticulously designed execution, finally broke his polished facade. The slick, arrogant businessman vanished. A feral, cornered animal took his place. "You think you are so smart?" Bradley hissed, his face twisting into an ugly, sneering mask. He paced back and forth across the expensive carpet, running a frantic hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You think sitting in that big leather chair makes you better than me, Jada. You are nothing but a diversity hire who got lucky. You and your entire pathetic family." Tasha gasped, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. Bradley, what are you saying? We are your family. I am your wife. Bradley turned on her with lightning speed, his eyes burning with pure, unfiltered contempt. You are a human ATM, Tasha. That is all you ever were to me. Did you honestly believe I married you for your sparkling personality? I married you because I saw exactly how desperate your parents were for validation. I took one look at DeAndre and Yvonne and knew they would bend over backward to have a white man sitting at their dining room table. They wanted proximity to whiteness so badly, they were willing to hand over their entire generational wealth just to buy it. And I was more than happy to cash their checks. DeAndre let out a strangled cry, attempting to stand up, but his knees buckled. He fell heavily back into his seat. The devastating truth of Bradley's words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Yvonne sat in completely stunned silence, paralyzed by the horrific reality unfolding before her eyes. The man she had worshipped, the man she had elevated above her own flesh and blood, was violently tearing their dignity to shreds. "You people are so incredibly gullible," Bradley shouted, his voice echoing violently off the frosted glass walls of the boardroom. He pointed a shaking finger at my father. "You handed me $500,000 without asking for a single piece of verified collateral. You literally handed me the deed to your historic black legacy because I wore a tailored suit and smiled at your country club friends. You are pathetic. You are exactly what people like me expect you to be. Easy marks, desperate to buy your way out of your own skin." The overt, aggressive racism hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Bradley paced faster, waving his arms in a frantic, unhinged display of supreme entitlement. He was completely losing his mind, stripped of the unearned confidence that had carried him through his fraudulent life. "And you," Bradley snarled, turning his venomous gaze back to me. "You sit there acting like some corporate queen. You think you can destroy my life. I am Bradley. I come from a lineage you could never even comprehend. I will ruin you, Jada. I will tie this company up in endless litigation. I will go to the press and tell them you are running a discriminatory racket. I will make sure nobody in this city ever does business with a bitter, vindictive black woman who targets innocent entrepreneurs. You do not belong in this building. You belong back in the gutter." I sat perfectly still, resting my chin on my steepled fingers. I let his bigoted, hateful words wash over me without flinching. His threats were empty, the desperate flailing of a drowning man trying to pull anyone down with him. I simply watched him self-destruct in real time. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. "Are you quite finished throwing your temper tantrum, Bradley? Because every single word you just screamed has been recorded by the high-definition security cameras installed in the corners of this room. You just confessed to targeting my parents for financial exploitation, admitting you used their racial insecurities to defraud them out of $500,000. That adds a rather lovely layer of predatory behavior to the wire fraud charges. The authorities will absolutely love reviewing this video footage during your criminal trial." Tasha was sobbing uncontrollably now, her head buried in her arms on the mahogany table. The fairy tale life she had sacrificed everything to protect was revealed to be a grotesque, humiliating nightmare. She had lost her sister, alienated her nephew, and blindly defended a monster who viewed her merely as a walking bank account. Her golden child status meant absolutely nothing to the man she had proudly chosen over her own blood. My parents were utterly destroyed by the horrifying reality of their incredibly foolish actions. DeAndre stared blankly at the projected financial statements, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He had willingly sacrificed his own grandson for a man who despised him. Yvonne rocked back and forth slightly in her executive chair, her eyes wide and vacant. The grand historic brownstone they had inherited from their ancestors was gone, traded for a few leased luxury cars and gambling debts accumulated by a racist con artist. They had betrayed their own blood, and their reward was absolute crushing humiliation. Every terrible choice they made to elevate this malicious fraud over their own daughter had finally come back to destroy their precious legacy. They now had absolutely nothing left but the agonizing, inescapable truth of their very own monumental, catastrophic family failure. I did not need to raise my voice to match the chaotic energy radiating from the mahogany table. I watched the spectacular implosion of Bradley's false reality with profound detachment. The frantic screaming and pathetic bouncing off the frosted glass meant nothing to me anymore. I reached my right hand forward, resting my finger on a small recessed silver button located at the base of my executive console. I pressed it once. A soft chime echoed clearly over the intercom system integrated into the ceiling. Within 5 seconds, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with commanding force. 4 corporate security officers marched into the room in perfect synchronization. They were led by Jackson, my head of security, a towering professional man who tolerated zero disruptions in my building. The security team quickly formed an impenetrable wall of dark suits between my legal team and the hyperventilating fraud sitting at the opposite end. "Ms. Davis," Jackson said, keeping his eyes locked firmly on Bradley. "Do we have a security issue in here today?" "The venture capital pitch has officially concluded, Jackson," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "These individuals are no longer invited guests of Apex Capital. They are actively trespassing on private corporate property. Please escort the gentleman in the gray suit out of my building immediately. If he resists in any capacity, you have my full authorization to contact the Chicago Police Department and press formal trespassing charges." Bradley's pale face flushed with a terrifying violent shade of crimson. He leaped up from his leather chair so fast that it tipped over backward, crashing loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He lunged forward, slamming his fists onto the table, furiously sending glass water pitchers shattering into a dozen sharp pieces. "You cannot do this to me!" Bradley roared, his voice cracking with unhinged feral desperation. "I am a respected entrepreneur. You are a bitter, vindictive woman who is destroying a legitimate business because you are jealous of my success. I will sue you for every single penny you have. I will ruin your reputation in this city. Get your hands off me right now." Jackson did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He moved with swift, calculated precision, grabbing Bradley's right arm and twisting it firmly behind the arrogant man's back. 2 other security officers immediately flanked him, gripping his shoulders with uncompromising strength. They lifted him entirely off his feet, completely neutralizing his violent outburst in a matter of seconds. Tasha let out a blood-curdling, humiliated scream as she watched her supposedly elite, wealthy husband being physically restrained like a common criminal. The perfect, untouchable illusion of her glorious marriage was violently ripped away, exposing the pathetic, debt-ridden nightmare hiding underneath. Her golden child status, carefully maintained through years of stepping on my neck and elevating this racist fraud, had evaporated into thin air. She was no longer the superior sibling looking down on a struggling single mother. She was the absolute fool who had proudly chained herself to a malicious con artist. "Bradley, stop fighting them!" Tasha wailed, her voice thick with heavy sobs. Her expensive designer mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks, completely ruining her flawless appearance. "Please just stop making it worse. We have to go. They are going to arrest you." She scrambled out of her chair, her hands shaking so violently she could barely gather her luxury handbag from the floor. She looked at me with wide, devastated eyes, silently begging for a shred of mercy or a sudden reversal of this horrific nightmare. I offered her absolutely nothing. I stared back at her with the exact same cold, dismissive expression she had worn when she pushed that basket of dry bread toward my hungry, innocent son. The universe was simply returning the exact energy she had so ruthlessly put into it. "Escort them to the service elevator," I instructed Jackson, dismissing them with a final apathetic wave of my hand. "Ensure they leave the premises immediately." "You will pay for this, Jada!" Bradley screamed at the top of his lungs, thrashing wildly against the unyielding grip of my security team as they dragged him backward toward the open doors. "You think you won, but you are nothing. You hear me? You are absolutely nothing, without my family giving you relevance." His hateful, bigoted threats echoed down the immaculate corridors of the executive floor as Jackson and the officers physically forced him out of the boardroom. Tasha stumbled clumsily after them, her high heels catching on the carpet as she wept uncontrollably. She trailed behind her disgraced husband, her head bowed in profound, absolute humiliation. The walk of shame through my corporate headquarters was a brutal, unforgiving gauntlet. Bradley kicked and cursed, fighting against the guards all the way down the brightly lit hallway. Every single employee on the executive floor stepped out of their offices to witness the magnificent spectacle. The elite investment bankers, the forensic accountants, and the senior partners all stood silently watching the arrogant fraud being thrown out like garbage. When they reached the main reception area, the sleek glass lobby was completely silent. The same reception staff that Bradley and Tasha had so viciously insulted and belittled upon their arrival just an hour ago now stood proudly behind the marble desk. The receptionist watched with immense quiet satisfaction as the loud, arrogant man, who had demanded VIP treatment, was forcefully shoved toward the heavy exit doors. Tasha could not even lift her head to meet their eyes. She kept her face hidden behind her trembling hands, fully absorbing the catastrophic shame of her shattered reality. The heavy security doors slammed shut behind them, abruptly cutting off Bradley's frantic, racist screaming. The sudden silence that fell over the reception area was incredibly peaceful. The venomous infection had been successfully excised from my building. Back inside the boardroom, DeAndre and Yvonne sat completely paralyzed. They were trapped alone with me. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom remained securely shut, sealing my parents inside a reality they could no longer deny or manipulate. The chaotic, violent energy that Bradley had dragged into my corporate sanctuary was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, clinical silence. I leaned back into my executive chair, steepling my fingers and watching the two people who had systematically dismantled my self-worth for 34 years. They looked incredibly small, sitting at the far end of my massive mahogany table. The luxurious designer clothing they had worn to impress my venture capital firm now looked like cheap, ill-fitting costumes. DeAndre was the first to break from his frozen state of shock. He ran a trembling hand over his face, wiping away the thick layer of cold sweat that had accumulated on his forehead. He looked at the glowing projector screen, which still displayed the undeniable proof of Bradley's massive gambling debts and the squandered $500,000 loan. My father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his stiff, starched collar. Jada, DeAndre croaked, his voice entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. It was a weak, pathetic sound. Jada, please tell me this is some sort of complicated corporate misunderstanding. Tell me that money is not entirely gone. We put the deed to the historic brownstone on the line for that loan. That house has been in our family for 4 generations. My grandfather built that legacy with his bare hands. Your legacy is gone, Dad, I stated with absolute surgical precision. You did not just put the deed on the line, you actively signed it over to a bank to fund the fake, superficial lifestyle of a racist con artist who openly despised you. Bradley took your generational wealth and fed it directly into offshore betting accounts and leased sports cars. Every single cent is gone. Yvonne let out another sharp, agonizing wail, burying her face in her manicured hands. Her shoulders shook violently as the catastrophic reality of her impending homelessness finally breached her thick wall of denial. We are going to lose that, she sobbed, her voice muffled by her trembling fingers. The bank is going to foreclose on us. Our friends at the country club will find out. We will be completely ruined in this city. We will have absolutely nowhere to go. DeAndre stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Panic was rapidly giving way to a desperate, unearned sense of entitlement. He looked around the sleek, high-security boardroom, his eyes frantically taking in the expensive frosted glass, the elite legal team standing silently by the walls, and the undeniable wealth I had accumulated. The gears in his head were visibly turning as he calculated a new angle of survival. You have to fix this, DeAndre demanded, taking a tentative step toward my end of the table. You own this massive investment firm, Jada. You clearly have millions of dollars at your disposal. You can easily write a check to the bank right now and clear the debt. You can use your corporate accounts to bail us out and save the family home. It would be pocket change for a company of this size. I looked at the man who had allowed my son to be starved at a birthday dinner just 2 weeks prior. I felt a cold, dark amusement bubbling in my chest. You want me to fix it? I asked, raising a single eyebrow. You want me to use my hard-earned corporate capital to pay off a $500,000 debt that you willingly took on to support a fraud? You are my daughter, DeAndre insisted, his voice rising in volume as he attempted to summon his old patriarchal dominance. That brownstone is your heritage too. It is your moral duty to protect this family when we are in a financial crisis. You cannot just sit there in your fancy suit and watch your own parents lose everything they have ever worked for. You have to take personal responsibility for your family. I let out a slow, melodic laugh that sent a visible shiver down my mother's spine. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his demand was almost impressive. Personal responsibility. I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the phrase. That is a fascinating concept coming from you, Dad. Let us talk about personal responsibility. Do you remember the speech you gave me in the parking lot of Le Petit? Do you remember the lecture you delivered when I begged you for $2,000 to pay for Malik's emergency medical treatments? DeAndre froze, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to formulate a defense. You told me that bailing me out would only encourage my bad decisions. I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal freezing register. You looked at your own flesh and blood, your sick grandson, and you told me that I needed to learn the harsh consequences of my actions. You told me that successful people do not subsidize the failures of others. That was different, Yvonne cried out from her chair, looking up with tear-streaked, desperate eyes. We did not know you were struggling so badly. We thought we were teaching you independence. This is about the family legacy, Jada. We are talking about losing our home. And I was talking about losing my son's health. I fired back, my voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. But you chose to teach me independence instead. Well, congratulations, Mom. The lesson was incredibly effective. I learned to be so independent that I built a multi-million-dollar venture capital empire entirely without your help, your support, or your love. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table and locking eyes with my terrified parents. I am simply applying your own flawless parenting philosophy to this current situation. You made catastrophic financial decisions. Bailing you out encourages absolute irresponsibility. DeAndre's jaw went slack. The absolute finality of my refusal hung in the cold, conditioned air of the boardroom. He had expected anger. He had anticipated resentment. What he had not prepared himself for was my complete, chilling indifference to his impending ruin. Yvonne let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, desperately wrapping her arms tightly around her own torso, as if trying to hold her shattering reality together. She looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, desperately searching for the obedient, desperate daughter who used to beg for their affection. That version of me had died a long time ago, starved out of existence by their own cruelty. My father slammed his fist against the mahogany table, though the gesture lacked its usual intimidating power. It was the weak, flailing movement of a defeated man. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, betraying the sheer terror gripping his chest. He reminded me again of his grandfather, the man who laid the first bricks of that historic property, shedding blood and sweat to secure a piece of the American dream for his descendants. He accused me of destroying our bloodline's greatest achievement by refusing to intervene and save them from the bank. I did not argue with his emotional manipulation. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, desperate tone. Instead, I reached into the sleek leather briefcase resting beside my chair. My fingers grasped a thick, heavy manila folder. I pulled it out and placed it firmly on the polished wood surface. The sharp smack of the heavy paper hitting the table echoed loudly, cutting off my father's pathetic rambling. I placed my hand flat on top of the document, maintaining steady, unwavering eye contact with the two people who had so callously discarded my son over a plate of food. I pushed the folder forward. It glided smoothly across the vast expanse of the mahogany table, coming to a sudden halt directly in front of DeAndre. He stared at it as if it were a live, explosive device. His trembling hands hesitated, hovering in the air before he finally gathered the courage to pull it closer. Yvonne leaned in, her tear-stained face pale with sheer dread. They both knew whatever was inside that folder represented the absolute final nail in their proverbial coffin. Open it. I commanded, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. DeAndre fumbled with the clasp, his fingers clumsily pulling back the heavy paper flap. He stared down at the crisp legal documents inside. The bold black lettering at the top of the first page clearly stated it was a formal notice of debt transfer and foreclosure. I watched his eyes dart rapidly back and forth across the dense legal jargon, struggling to comprehend the massive scope of his own destruction. When Bradley submitted his initial pitch deck to Apex Capital 2 weeks ago, my forensic accountants did not just investigate his fraudulent gyms. I explained slowly, ensuring they absorbed every single syllable. They investigated all of his connected financial liabilities. That is how we discovered the $500,000 commercial lien placed against your historic brownstone. We also discovered that because Bradley had completely stopped paying you the promised interest, you had fallen severely behind on your own mortgage payments. The bank had already classified your loan as toxic defaulted debt. My mother gasped, covering her mouth to muffle a fresh wave of panicked sobs. Banks do not like holding on to toxic debt, Dad. I continued, leaning back into my chair. They prefer to sell it off to private equity firms at a slight discount to clear their balance sheets rapidly. They want the liability off their books without dealing with the messy eviction processes. So, before you even stepped foot into my corporate headquarters this morning, I made a very strategic business acquisition on behalf of my holding company. DeAndre looked up from the legal documents, his face entirely drained of blood. His eyes were wide with a horrifying realization. He slowly shook his head side to side, refusing to accept the catastrophic truth staring back at him in stark black and white. You bought the debt, he whispered, his voice cracking into a devastated hollow rasp. You bought the mortgage from the bank. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that offered absolutely no comfort. I bought the debt in its entirety, Dad. And since you are currently in severe irreversible default with absolutely no means of paying off a $500,000 balloon payment, my firm has successfully executed an immediate foreclosure on the collateral property. I paused, letting the crushing weight of my words settle heavily over their broken spirits. I am not just the CEO who rejected your golden son-in-law. I am now the sole legal owner of the historic family brownstone. The very legacy you recklessly risked on a racist con artist now belongs entirely to the daughter you discarded. Yvonne collapsed forward, her head resting on the mahogany table as she wept with loud, uncontrollable agony. The poetic justice of the moment was absolute and undeniable. They had gladly gambled their ancestral home, their dignity, and their family legacy just to buy proximity to whiteness and superficial status. They had willingly sacrificed my son's health and my well-being to elevate an arrogant fraud who despised them. Now every single brick, every pristine hardwood floor, and every historic memory attached to that magnificent property was permanently and legally registered under my private holding company. I had not just simply taken away their money. I had methodically stripped away the unearned superiority they had weaponized against me for decades. I had taken back the power they had wielded over my life. The grand empire they thought they possessed was completely gone, nothing but dust scattered in the bitter wind, and I was the one holding the urn. They traded their entire world for a terrible lie, and I purchased the absolute truth. I closed the heavy manila folder, the sharp slap of cardboard cutting through my mother's agonizing sobs. DeAndre did not move a single muscle. His eyes remained locked on the space where the foreclosure document had just been, as if he expected the ink to rearrange itself into a different reality. I leaned forward, resting my forearms against the polished mahogany table, making sure my voice carried absolute, unwavering authority. You have exactly 72 hours to pack your belongings and permanently vacate my property. I announced, my words landing like heavy stones in the silent boardroom. The clock starts right now. By 9 o'clock on Friday morning, my private security team will arrive at the historic brownstone. They will be accompanied by local law enforcement officers and a state-appointed eviction liquidator. If you are still inside that house, or if any of your personal possessions remain on the premises, you will be physically removed for trespassing, and your belongings will be thrown into a commercial dumpster. DeAndre snapped out of his catatonic trance. He lunged forward, hands slamming flat against the table. You cannot do this, Jada. You cannot throw your parents out onto the street with only 3 days' notice. Where are we supposed to go? We do not have a single dollar left in our savings accounts. We do not have any credit cards that will not decline. We cannot even afford a cheap motel room. You have to give us more time. Give us at least a month to figure something out. Time is a luxury afforded to people who tell the truth. Dad, I replied, feeling no sympathy for the desperate panic twisting his features. You gave me zero warning when you chose to gamble away the only safety net this family possessed. You gave my son zero consideration when you humiliated him at a dinner table to impress a racist fraud. I am giving you 72 hours. That is 72 hours more than you deserve. Stop wasting your precious time arguing with me and start looking for cardboard boxes. Yvonne suddenly pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She stumbled forward, her knees buckling completely as she reached the edge of the table. She collapsed onto the floor, her expensive designer dress pooling around her as she fell to her knees. She crawled toward my chair, her hands desperately reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored suit pants. Jackson, my head of security, immediately took a swift step forward to intervene, but I raised my hand, signaling him to hold his position. I wanted to hear exactly what she was going to say. Please, Jada, I am begging you. Yvonne wailed, her face entirely streaked with dark, ruined makeup and fresh tears. She clasped her hands together in a frantic, pathetic prayer. Please forgive us. We made a horrific mistake. We were completely blinded by Bradley's charm. He manipulated us. He used his fancy job title to trick us into believing he was going to elevate our family. He promised us the world. We honestly thought we were making a brilliant financial investment. We did not know he was a monster. We never meant to hurt you or Malik. Please show us mercy. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, watching her grovel on the floor of my corporate headquarters. The sight did not bring me joy, but it did bring me a profound, necessary sense of closure. I reached down and firmly removed her trembling hands from the fabric of my trousers. Get up, Mom, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Do not humiliate yourself further by lying to my face. This was never about Bradley manipulating you. Bradley was just the convenient, shiny excuse you used to justify your own toxic behavior. Yvonne shook her head violently, remaining on her knees. No, Jada, I swear to you, it was him. He poisoned our minds. He did not poison anything that was not already corrupted. I fired back, my tone sharpened into a lethal blade. Do not dare blame your lifelong cruelty on a man you met 4 years ago. Bradley did not force you to lock me out of family group chats. Bradley did not force you to skip my college graduation because Tasha had a minor cold. Bradley did not force you to look at my beautiful, intelligent son and treat him like an unwanted stray dog while you showered Tasha's children with endless luxury. I stood up from my executive chair, forcing my mother to crane her neck upward just to look at me. Your betrayal has absolutely nothing to do with Bradley's fake charm. Your betrayal is about your continuous, deliberate choice to view me and my child as inherently inferior. You looked at my status as a single mother and decided I was a permanent stain on your precious social standing. You worshipped Tasha because she married a wealthy white man, and you believed that proximity to his whiteness would somehow validate your own existence in this city. DeAndre bowed his head, utterly defeated by the brutal, undeniable accuracy of my words. He knew I was stripping away the very core of their superficial identities. You wanted a golden child so badly that you willingly handed over your entire generational legacy to a con artist. I continued pacing slowly around the edge of the table. You thought Tasha's marriage was your golden ticket to the country club elite. You sacrificed me because I did not fit your perfect narrative. Now the very daughter you actively tried to erase from your family tree is the only reason you are not already sleeping on a park bench. I own the brownstone. I own the debt. I own the consequences of your pathetic bigotry. Yvonne let out a choked gasp, finally pulling herself up from the floor. She leaned heavily against the mahogany table, her body trembling with exhaustion and devastating shame. We are your blood, Jada. How can you be so incredibly cold to your own flesh and blood? I am not cold, Mom, I replied smoothly, looking her directly in the eyes. I am just conducting business. You taught me that family loyalty is entirely conditional. You taught me that respect must be purchased. Well, I purchased the brownstone, but I am absolutely not buying your fake apologies. Your tears are not born of genuine remorse. Your tears are born of pure, selfish terror, because you finally realize that the scapegoat you kicked to the curb is actually the dragon who bought the entire kingdom. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit doors of the boardroom. 72 hours. Take only your clothing and personal toiletries. Everything else inside that house, every piece of antique furniture, historic painting, and heirloom now belongs to Apex Capital to satisfy your defaulted debt. If you steal or destroy any property on your way out, my legal team will file immediate criminal charges. Have a wonderful afternoon. That evening, long after the boardroom had been cleared and the security protocols reset, I returned to the sanctuary of my estate. The drive home felt entirely different, lighter, as if a physical crushing weight had been surgically removed from my spine. I found Malik in our expansive library, sprawled on a plush rug, engrossed in a colorful book about marine biology. He looked up, his dark eyes bright and completely unburdened. "Mommy, you look happy," he observed, his young intuition piercing right through my corporate armor. I knelt beside him, gently brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "I am baby. We are going to build something wonderful." I did not tell him about the foreclosure, the screaming, or the absolute destruction of his grandparents' false empire. He did not need to carry the ugly, toxic details of my revenge. All he needed to know was that the people who had deliberately made him feel small would never be allowed to cast a shadow over his life again. I spent the next 2 hours sitting on the floor with him, building elaborate Lego structures, relishing the profound, uninterrupted peace of our home. The silence of the house that night was not lonely. It was the beautiful, resonant sound of absolute freedom. We ordered his favorite deep dish pizza, ate it right out of the cardboard box in our pajamas, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. The stark contrast between this joyful, messy reality and the stiff, oppressive atmosphere of Le Petit was staggering. It was the first night in my entire life that I did not spare a single thought, worrying about how to earn my parents' approval. I had finally accepted that their love was a bankrupt currency, and I was officially no longer accepting it as payment. The very next morning, the bitter reality of their impending homelessness must have fully suffocated whatever remaining pride my family possessed. They had spent the entire night frantically calling lawyers, banks, and former country club friends, only to discover that my legal team had executed the foreclosure with flawless, impenetrable precision. There were no hidden loopholes to exploit, and absolutely no wealthy friends willing to lend them $500,000 to clean up Bradley's fraudulent mess. Desperation has a unique way of forcing people to seek salvation from the exact same hands they previously tried to cut off. Through a desperate public records search, my father finally managed to locate my primary residential address. They piled into my mother's aging sedan and drove out to the exclusive, highly secured northern suburbs of Chicago, hoping to launch one final pathetic appeal to my humanity. They expected to find a nice upscale apartment or perhaps a modest suburban house. What they found instead completely shattered the very last remnants of their fragile, superficial egos. I sat in my home office sipping a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee while reviewing the live feed from my perimeter security cameras. My estate sits on 8 acres of pristine, meticulously landscaped property, hidden behind 12-foot-high wrought iron gates and a perimeter wall of dense, mature cedar trees. The main house is a sprawling, modern architectural masterpiece, featuring natural stone massive walls of custom glass and sweeping views of a private lake. It is a multi-million-dollar fortress of absolute peace that I built entirely from the ground up, completely without their financial support, their emotional validation, or their oppressive toxic presence. I watched the video monitor as my mother's modest sedan slowly rolled up to the heavy security gates. The sheer contrast between their current reality and my daily existence was visually staggering. DeAndre, Yvonne, and Tasha stepped out of the car, standing on the immaculate cobblestone driveway. They craned their necks upward, their eyes tracing the imposing height of the iron gates and the sweeping, majestic lines of my estate visible in the distance. The absolute shock radiating from their postures was palpable even through a security camera lens. For decades, they had relentlessly conditioned me to believe that I was destined for a life of mediocrity. They had convinced themselves that without their guidance and without the proximity to whiteness that Bradley supposedly provided, I would forever remain a struggling, helpless single mother. Now they were standing outside a magnificent empire that utterly dwarfed the historic brownstone they had so foolishly lost. They were literally locked out of the generational wealth I had quietly accumulated while they were busy serving me dry bread in a restaurant. My father hesitantly approached the glowing keypad mounted on the stone pillar next to the gate. He pressed the silver call button. A soft chime echoed in my home office. I pressed the intercom button on my desk console, allowing my voice to project clearly through the external speakers at the front gate. "You are currently trespassing on private property," I announced, my voice completely devoid of any welcoming warmth. "State your business immediately, or my security team will contact the local authorities." DeAndre flinched at the booming sound of my voice. He leaned closer to the intercom microphone, his face tight with profound humiliation. "Jada, please open the gate. It is your father. Your mother and your sister are out here with me. We drove all the way out here because we desperately need to talk to you face to face. We cannot have a conversation through a metal box." "We had our face-to-face conversation yesterday in my boardroom, Dad," I replied smoothly, watching him wince on the high-definition monitor. "I explicitly told you that you have 72 hours to vacate my newly acquired property. Coming to my private residence to beg will not stop the eviction clock from ticking down." Yvonne shoved her way past my father, pressing her tear-stained face uncomfortably close to the camera lens. Her eyes were red and swollen, completely stripped of the arrogant condescension she had worn like a crown her entire life. "Jada, baby, please let us inside," my mother cried, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "You have this massive, beautiful home. We can clearly see how incredibly successful you are. You have more than enough space to let us stay here while we figure out our next steps. We are your family. You cannot just leave us with absolutely nowhere to go." "I am not running a charity shelter for people who deliberately starve my child," I fired back, making sure my enunciation was razor sharp. "You chose your family when you handed the deed of your historic home over to a racist con artist. You made your bed with Bradley, Mom. Now you get to sleep in it." Tasha suddenly stepped into the camera frame. She looked absolutely wretched. Her designer clothes were heavily wrinkled, and the golden child aura that had protected her for 30 years had completely evaporated into thin air. She looked directly into the camera, her hands shaking violently at her sides. "Jada, please," Tasha begged, her voice barely a pathetic broken whisper. "Bradley completely drained my personal checking accounts before he disappeared last night. I have absolutely zero money left to my name. I cannot afford to hire a divorce attorney. I cannot even afford to buy groceries for my children today. You have all of this wealth. You have millions of dollars. I am begging you to help me. I am your sister." I looked at the screen, observing the total devastation of the woman who had mercilessly tormented me. I felt absolutely no pity whatsoever. I felt absolutely no obligation. I leaned closer to the microphone on my desk. I just stared at them with absolute cold detachment. I let the heavy silence hang suspended between us now. The digital static of the intercom crackled softly in my spacious office before I finally decided to speak. "You have mistaken my silence for hesitation, Tasha," I stated, my voice projecting clearly through the outdoor speakers. "I am simply marveling at the breathtaking audacity it takes for you to stand outside my gates and demand my resources after spending a lifetime trying to destroy my self-worth." Tasha gripped the wrought iron bars of the security gate, her knuckles turning stark white. She pressed her face closer to the gaps, her eyes wild with panic. "Jada, you do not understand how incredibly bad it is," she pleaded, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Bradley emptied every single joint account we shared. He took the kids' savings. He took my jewelry to a pawn shop this morning before he vanished. I literally have nothing left. I cannot afford a divorce lawyer to fight him for custody. I need $50,000, Jada, please. I know you have it. You have to help me fight the man who destroyed our family." "Bradley did not destroy our family, Tasha," I corrected her sharply, making sure every syllable landed like a physical blow. "He merely exposed the deep, festering rot that was already there." You chose to marry a racist fraud because you valued superficial status over genuine substance. You elevated him above your own flesh and blood. You cheered when he threatened to throw my son onto the street. Why would I finance your divorce from the monster you proudly created and defended? Yvonne leaned heavily over Tasha's shoulder. Jada, please listen to reason. My mother begged, her voice trembling with unadulterated terror. If you do not care about Tasha, at least think about your father and me. We are elderly. We cannot survive living in a dangerous motel. We cannot start our lives over at our advanced age. You have this massive, beautiful estate. We could live quietly in the guest house. We would not bother you. We just need a secure roof over our heads until we figure out how to recover from this horrific nightmare. You had a secure roof over your heads, I reminded them coldly, staring at the screen. You had a historic, fully paid-off brownstone that our ancestors bled and suffered for. You willingly signed the deed away to impress a con artist who openly despised your race. You do not get to use my private estate as a consolation prize for your catastrophic bigotry and endless greed. DeAndre stepped forward, trying to summon whatever remaining shred of patriarchal authority he thought he possessed. We are your parents, Jada. You owe us respect. You owe us basic human decency. We raised you. We provided for you. You cannot just abandon us like this when we are facing absolute financial ruin. I owe you absolutely nothing, I fired back, my voice slicing through the crisp morning air. You provided the bare minimum required by law, and you accompanied it with decades of relentless emotional abuse. You made sure I knew every single day that I was your greatest disappointment. You treated my beautiful, intelligent child like an unwanted burden. You demanded my respect while offering me nothing but pure, unfiltered contempt. Tasha began to sob loudly, sinking to her knees on the cold cobblestone driveway. Please, Jada, she wailed, her hands grasping the iron gate as if it were a life raft. I will do anything you want. I will work for you. I will clean your house. Just give me the money for a lawyer. I cannot lose my children to him. You know what it is like to fiercely protect a child. You are a dedicated mother. Please have compassion for my innocent kids. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, staring at the pathetic display unfolding on my security monitors. I thought about Malik. I thought about the bright, hopeful look in his dark eyes at the restaurant and how quickly Tasha had maliciously extinguished it just to assert her imaginary dominance. I am a mother, I confirmed, making sure my enunciation was perfectly clear over the speakers, and my absolute first priority is protecting my son from toxic, malicious people like you. Do you remember the birthday dinner at Le Petit Tasha? Do you remember when my 8-year-old son looked up at you hungry and excited for a special meal? Do you remember exactly what you did? Tasha froze instantly, her loud crying hitching painfully in her throat. She looked up directly at the camera, her eyes wide with sudden, horrifying realization. The memory of her own cruelty had finally caught up to her. You grabbed a basket of cold, dry bread. I recounted, my tone dropping to a lethal, freezing whisper that commanded absolute attention. You slid that basket across the white tablecloth until it hit his glass. You looked at my innocent child and you told him that premium food was not for him. You told him to eat a breadstick, and you smiled wickedly while you did it. You wanted to humiliate him just to prove that you and your fraudulent husband were vastly superior to us. My parents stood completely silent, the crushing weight of their complicity pinning them to the ground. They had laughed along with her. They had fiercely defended the cruelty. You want compassion for your children, Tasha? I asked, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of permanent closure settling into my bones. I will give you the exact same level of compassion that you proudly gave to my son. I leaned forward and pressed my finger firmly against the intercom button. Eat a breadstick, Tasha. I released the button, permanently cutting the audio feed. I watched the monitor in absolute silence as Tasha collapsed onto the driveway. I calmly powered down the monitor, plunging the screen into total darkness. I sipped my coffee, knowing the toxic infection was locked outside my gates. I set my coffee mug down on the polished marble coaster, the soft clink echoing in the quiet sanctuary of my home office. The security monitor remained black, a perfect reflection of the absolute void where my familial guilt used to reside. I had spent 34 years carrying the suffocating weight of their expectations, always striving to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of recognizing it. That exhausting chapter of my life was officially closed. It was time to initiate the final phase of my strategy. I reached for my desk phone and dialed the direct encrypted line to Marcus, my lead acquisitions attorney. He answered on the first ring, his tone perfectly professional and entirely devoid of hesitation. Marcus, the waiting period has expired. I instructed, my voice sharp and decisive. It is time to execute the final directive regarding Bradley's venture capital submission. Deliver the entire physical dossier to the federal authorities immediately. I had not simply retained the fraudulent pitch deck Bradley had so arrogantly presented in my boardroom. My forensic accountants had spent the last 48 hours compiling a meticulous, airtight binder of his financial crimes. We had cross-referenced his forged tax returns, his fabricated profit and loss statements, and the glaring inconsistencies in his commercial gym leases. We meticulously traced the exact digital path of the $500,000 he had swindled from my parents, documenting every single wire transfer to offshore sports betting syndicates and luxury car rental agencies. He had willingly walked into my corporate headquarters and handed me the murder weapon for his own life. Submitting fraudulent financial documents across state lines to a registered venture capital firm constituted massive wire fraud. It was a severe federal offense, and I was wrapping it up for the authorities with a neat, undeniable bow. I ensured every single falsified document was properly highlighted, leaving absolutely zero room for plausible deniability. Marcus confirmed the courier was already en route to the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, accompanied by our liaison from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The wheels of justice can sometimes grind with agonizing slowness, but when a billionaire's legal team hands federal prosecutors a perfectly documented open and shut case of multi-million-dollar investor fraud, those wheels suddenly spin with terrifying breakneck speed. I spent the next 24 hours working remotely from my estate, reviewing legitimate portfolios, and spending quality time with Malik. I did not check my phone for frantic messages from my parents. I simply waited for the inevitable explosion. It arrived precisely at noon on Thursday. I was sitting in my living room when my tablet buzzed with an urgent news alert from a prominent Chicago business journal. The headline flashed across the screen in bold, undeniable text. Luxury fitness CEO investigated for massive investor fraud and embezzlement. I tapped the notification, casting the live news feed directly onto my massive television screen. The local news anchors looked appropriately grim as they broke the story to the city. The broadcast cut to live shaky helicopter footage hovering over Bradley's flagship gym location in River North. The parking lot, usually filled with expensive European sports cars belonging to his wealthy, oblivious clientele, was currently swarming with dark, unmarked federal vehicles. The camera zoomed in just as the heavy glass doors of the fitness center swung violently open. Bradley emerged into the harsh daylight, but he was not wearing his signature tailored Italian suit. He was wearing a cheap, wrinkled tracksuit, looking disheveled, panicked, and entirely stripped of his unearned arrogance. His hands were securely fastened behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. Two stern-faced federal agents flanked him aggressively, guiding him toward the back of a waiting transport vehicle. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy who had laughed at my struggling son was currently being paraded across local television like a common, pathetic criminal. He tried to duck his head to hide his face from the circling news cameras, but the damage was already permanently done. His carefully constructed upper-class illusion was disintegrating into dust on a live high-definition broadcast. The news reporter detailed the extensive, horrifying list of charges: wire fraud, bank fraud, embezzlement, and predatory exploitation of private investors. The anchor explained how Bradley had been actively running a sophisticated shell game, siphoning money from his gyms and his own family members to cover massive illegal gambling debts, while completely failing to pay his employees. The public humiliation was absolute and comprehensive. In the ruthless, status-obsessed social circles of Chicago and Fairfield, there is absolutely no sin greater than being exposed as a broke, desperate fraud. His elite country club memberships were instantly revoked. His wealthy friends and business associates immediately blocked his number, scrambling frantically to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The very people who had once toasted his success were now gossiping viciously about his spectacular, humiliating downfall. I watched the television screen as the camera panned to the edge of the gym parking lot. Tasha was standing behind yellow police tape, surrounded by aggressive reporters, shoving microphones into her face. She looked completely hollowed out, weeping hysterically, as the federal agents shoved her supposedly elite husband into the back of the dark vehicle. She had proudly staked her entire identity, her self-worth, and her familial superiority on marrying a wealthy white savior. She had viciously stepped on my neck for decades just to maintain the illusion that she was winning at life. Now the entire city was watching her weep over a bankrupt con artist. The golden child had completely lost her shine, exposed to the world as a gullible, tragic fool who had traded her own sister for a handful of counterfeit diamonds. I reached out and calmly pressed the mute button on the television remote. The frantic, chaotic noise of their shattered reality faded into absolute, beautiful silence within the secure walls of my estate. Excellent. The 72-hour deadline expired precisely at 9 o'clock on Friday morning. I did not remain locked away inside my estate for this particular milestone. I wanted to witness the final transition of power with my own two eyes. My private driver pulled my dark SUV up to the curb of the historic brownstone parking discreetly across the street beneath the shade of an old oak tree. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, wrapping my tailored wool coat tightly around my shoulders. The street was completely dominated by the presence of my legal execution team. 3 commercial moving trucks were parked along the curb. Jackson and his team of corporate security officers stood in a formidable synchronized line across the front steps of the property, accompanied by 2 uniformed police officers to ensure absolute compliance. I walked slowly up the front pathway. The heavy oak front door of my newly acquired property stood wide open. Inside the foyer, complete chaos was unfolding. My hired eviction liquidators were moving through the house with stunning efficiency. They were professionally cataloging every piece of antique furniture, every crystal chandelier, and every valuable piece of art that my parents had forfeit by defaulting on their toxic loan. DeAndre and Yvonne stood near the base of the grand mahogany staircase, looking completely unrecognizable. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had constantly belittled my single motherhood was now reduced to a trembling, hollowed-out shell of a man. He clutched a single small cardboard box containing his personal clothing, his eyes darting frantically as the movers wrapped his prized leather armchair in thick, moving blankets. Yvonne was weeping silently, leaning heavily against the wall for physical support. She wore a simple, faded sweater entirely stripped of the designer furs and diamond jewelry she used to flaunt at the country club. Tasha emerged from the kitchen, dragging 2 battered suitcases behind her. She looked utterly destroyed. Following Bradley's spectacular public arrest for federal wire fraud, the bank had immediately frozen all of her remaining joint accounts pending the criminal investigation. She was now officially penniless, publicly disgraced, and entirely dependent on the very parents she had helped bankrupt. Her 2 children stood quietly beside her, looking confused and frightened by the swarm of strangers dismantling their world. I felt a brief passing pang of sympathy for my nephew and niece, but I quickly reminded myself that I had offered to feed my own son at a restaurant, and Tasha had deliberately handed him dry bread. She was now reaping the exact harvest she had so maliciously planted. Jackson stepped forward, holding a silver pocket watch. He looked directly at my father. "Mr. Davis, the designated eviction period has officially concluded. You must exit the premises immediately, or you will be physically escorted off the property by the local authorities." My father looked up, his bloodshot eyes finally landing on me as I stood quietly in the doorway. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to launch one final desperate plea for mercy. But the words died instantly in his throat. He saw the cold, unyielding resolve etched permanently across my face. He finally understood that there was absolutely no forgiveness left to extract. He lowered his head, gripping his cardboard box tightly, and shuffled slowly toward the exit. He walked past me without making eye contact, entirely broken by his own catastrophic arrogance. Yvonne followed close behind him, her shoulders shaking violently with fresh, uncontrollable sobs. She did not even attempt to speak to me. Tasha grabbed her children by the hands, pulling her suitcases over the threshold. She shot me one fleeting venomous look, a pathetic dying ember of her former superiority before stepping out into the cold morning air. I watched them load their meager belongings into the trunk of Yvonne's aging sedan. The luxury leased vehicles were gone, repossessed the very morning Bradley was paraded across the local news in handcuffs. My parents' country clubs, the elite social circle they had sacrificed my son to impress, were nowhere to be found. The neighbors they had desperately tried to outshine were peeking through their expensive curtains, watching the dramatic eviction unfold with gossiping, judgmental eyes. My family had been entirely cut off, excommunicated from polite society, and left completely isolated in their profound humiliation. The sedans sputtered to life, blowing dark exhaust into the crisp morning air. I knew exactly where they were heading. My private investigator had tracked their frantic last-minute housing arrangements. Because their credit scores were entirely obliterated by the foreclosure and the massive unpaid personal loans, Bradley had forced them to sign absolutely no reputable landlord in the city would approve their rental applications. They were forced to secure two cramped adjoining rooms at a notoriously cheap rundown motel located on the dilapidated outskirts of the city. It was a bleak, depressing establishment surrounded by cracked asphalt, flickering neon signs, and heavy industrial noise. It was a place reserved for the desperate and the forgotten, a place my mother would have previously refused to even drive past. Now it was their new permanent reality. They would have to squeeze into those tiny, unventilated rooms surrounded by the crushing reality of their massive, unforgivable failure. Tasha would have to navigate the nightmare of the public welfare system to feed her children, discovering firsthand the grueling, exhausting reality of being a broke single mother that she had so viciously mocked me for. DeAndre and Yvonne would spend their remaining twilight years trapped in a cheap motel room, entirely stripped of the generational wealth and social prestige they had worshipped above their own flesh and blood. They had traded a historic castle for a temporary illusion, and they were left with absolutely nothing but the profound, agonizing weight of their own catastrophic bigotry. They were finally forced to learn the brutal lesson of accountability. Their complete departure from my life was an absolute triumph. The heavy oak front door closed behind me with a resounding final thud, shutting out the bustling noise of the Chicago street. For the very first time in my 34 years of life, I stood entirely alone inside the historic family brownstone. The eviction liquidators had done an exceptionally thorough job. The sprawling foyer, once cluttered with my mother's ostentatious crystal vases and my father's intimidating antique furniture, was now completely bare. The polished hardwood floors stretched out before me, empty and pristine, reflecting the soft afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass transom window above the doorway. I slowly walked into the main formal living room, my high heels echoing loudly in the vast hollow space. This was the exact room where a decade ago I had fallen to my knees and begged DeAndre and Yvonne for a $2,000 loan to save Malik's life. I remembered the suffocating coldness of this room. I remembered how my father had stood right by the marble fireplace looking down at me with absolute disgust, telling me that my struggles as a single mother were a burden he simply refused to carry. I walked over to that same fireplace and ran my hand along the cool carved marble mantel. The oppressive toxic energy that had choked the life out of me in this house was completely gone. The ghosts of my childhood trauma had been forcefully evicted alongside the people who created them. I walked up the grand, sweeping staircase, tracing my fingers along the polished cherry wood banister. I walked past the massive master suite where my parents had plotted to hand over our generational wealth to a racist con artist. I walked past Tasha's old bedroom, the largest and brightest room on the second floor, where she had been groomed to believe she was infinitely superior to me. Finally, I reached the end of the narrow hallway and pushed open the door to my old bedroom. It was the smallest room in the house. It still carried the faint, lingering scent of the lavender paint I had desperately hated. Standing in the center of that small, empty square, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation wash over my entire soul. The scared, isolated girl who used to cry herself to sleep within these walls was officially dead. The powerful, uncompromising woman who had purchased the entire kingdom stood in her place completely victorious. I walked back downstairs to the main level, taking my time to absorb the absolute magnitude of my acquisition. This brownstone was not just a piece of premium real estate. It was a monumental symbol of Black excellence and generational resilience. My great-grandparents had faced unimaginable discrimination and systemic barriers to purchase this property. They had bled to ensure their descendants would always have a secure, undeniable stake in this city. DeAndre and Yvonne had recklessly gambled that sacred legacy away. They had willingly offered up our ancestral crown to a white fraud because they believed his proximity would magically elevate their social standing. They traded their heritage for an illusion. By purchasing the defaulted debt and executing the foreclosure, I had not just exacted a perfectly tailored revenge. I had effectively rescued our true family legacy from the hands of an arrogant thief. I had secured the foundation my ancestors built, ensuring it would never again be jeopardized by the pathetic, superficial greed of my parents. I owned the bricks, the mortar, and the history. But as I looked around the massive, echoing parlor, I knew with absolute certainty that I could never actually live here. The memories embedded in the plaster were far too bitter. The shadows of their emotional abuse were too deeply ingrained in the architecture. This house needed to be completely purged. It needed to be violently stripped down to the studs and resurrected into something that brought actual light into the world. I heard the heavy front door open again, followed by the sound of heavy work boots stepping onto the foyer floor. Marcus, my lead acquisitions attorney, walked into the living room accompanied by David, the chief architectural contractor for Apex Capital. David unrolled a massive tube of blue blueprints across a temporary folding table his team had set up in the center of the room. He looked around the expansive, empty parlor with a highly professional, incredibly calculating eye. "It is a magnificent historic property, Ms. Davis," David said, gesturing toward the high vaulted ceilings and the intricate crown molding. "We can begin all the luxury residential renovations immediately. With a property of this immense scale, we can easily convert the upper floors into a stunning master penthouse suite for you and your son. We can have it move-in ready within 6 months." I stepped up to the folding table and placed my hands flat against the edges of the unrolled blueprints. "I am not moving into this house, David," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unwavering purpose. "I do not want a luxury penthouse. I want you to completely gut the entire interior. Tear down every single non-load-bearing wall on the residential floors. I want you to redesign this entire property from the very ground up." David blinked in surprise, pulling a pen from his pocket. "What exactly is the new vision for the space, Ms. Davis?" I looked around the room, visualizing the incredible transformation. "The ground floor will be a state-of-the-art community center and a professional co-working space," I instructed clearly. "The upper 3 floors will be converted into 8 fully furnished premium residential suites. We are officially transforming this massive historic property into a fully funded, permanent housing initiative and a professional business incubator exclusively designed for single Black mothers to succeed. The very people my parents absolutely despised will now thrive in their former castle. I want my new architectural team to get to work right now, bringing this beautiful vision to life." During the 6 months it took David and his architectural team to completely gut and rebuild the historic brownstone, my own personal life underwent a similarly beautiful renovation. Without the constant, suffocating drain of my family's toxic expectations, I had so much more energy to pour into what truly mattered. Malik transferred to an elite progressive private academy where his brilliant mind was nurtured rather than suppressed. He joined the school debate team, took up the cello, and blossomed into a vibrant, outgoing child who never once hesitated to ask for a second helping at the dinner table. Watching him thrive with such pure, unshakable confidence was the ultimate validation of every ruthless choice I had made in that corporate boardroom. Simultaneously, the foundation took shape with breathtaking speed. I did not just write the checks from behind a desk. I was heavily involved in the grassroots vetting process. I sat across from countless single Black mothers, listening to their dreams, their struggles, and their undeniable brilliance. I saw reflections of my younger, exhausted self in their tired but fiercely determined eyes. Providing them with the seed capital and the financial safety net that my own parents had violently denied me felt like actively closing a painful gaping wound. We were not just building a community center, we were forging an impenetrable armor for the next generation. The city's elite social circles whispered about my ruthless corporate takeover, but I did not care. Their opinions were as worthless to me as Bradley's bounced platinum credit cards. Every swing of the sledgehammer at the old brownstone physically chipped away at the generational trauma making room for a legacy built on genuine empowerment instead of exclusionary greed. I was busy writing a brand new history, one where women like me did not just survive the brutal storm, but eventually owned the weather. Exactly 6 months later, the crisp spring air of Chicago carried the sounds of joyous celebration down the historic tree-lined street. The transformation of the brownstone was finally complete. I stood on the freshly poured concrete steps of the newly renovated property, watching a massive crowd of supporters, local politicians and media personnel gather on the sidewalk. The imposing, oppressive facade that had once symbolized my parents' exclusionary, superficial worldview had been completely revitalized. The dark, heavy curtains were gone, replaced by massive, welcoming glass windows that flooded the interior with bright, natural sunlight. The imposing iron gates had been permanently removed. A beautiful, sleek bronze plaque was now proudly mounted next to the front door. It read, "The Malik Foundation Empowering Black Excellence." Today was the official grand opening of the fully funded community center and premier housing initiative I had envisioned. The ground floor, once cluttered with my mother's pretentious antiques, was now a vibrant state-of-the-art co-working space. It featured high-speed internet stations, private meeting pods, and a fully staffed complimentary childcare center. The upper floors housed 8 magnificent fully furnished residential suites. These premium apartments were currently occupied by 8 incredibly driven, brilliant single Black mothers who were actively pursuing higher education and launching their own entrepreneurial ventures. My foundation was covering their housing, their childcare, and their business development costs entirely. The very people my parents had aggressively scorned and deemed unworthy of respect were now the celebrated, honored residents of their former castle. A prominent local news anchor approached the steps with a camera crew trailing closely behind her. The flashing red light on the camera indicated we were broadcasting live across the entire city of Chicago. The reporter smiled warmly, holding her microphone out toward me. "Ms. Davis, the transformation of this historic property is absolutely breathtaking," the reporter said, her voice projecting clearly over the cheering crowd. "You have taken a private generational family home and turned it into a monumental beacon of hope for single mothers in our community. What inspired you to create this specific initiative?" I looked directly into the camera lens. I stood tall in my tailored emerald green suit, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace. Legacy is a word that people often misunderstand. I explained, ensuring my voice carried absolute clarity and unwavering conviction. Many people believe that a legacy is simply about hoarding wealth behind closed doors and excluding others to feel superior. But true power and true wealth are measured by how many people you can uplift. As a single mother myself, I know intimately how hard it is to build an empire when the world constantly tells you that you are destined to fail. I wanted to create a sanctuary where ambitious, dedicated women are given the exact resources, the respect, and the unyielding support they need to shatter every single ceiling placed above them. The crowd erupted into massive, roaring applause. I smiled and grabbed the oversized golden scissors provided by the city council. With one swift, decisive motion, I cut the thick red ribbon draped across the front entrance. The cheering grew even louder as the heavy wooden doors swung open, inviting the community inside the beautiful, newly resurrected space. Miles away, on the dilapidated outskirts of the city, a harsh, flickering light illuminated a cramped, heavily stained motel room. The air inside the tiny room was stale, smelling faintly of cheap cleaning supplies and profound despair. DeAndre and Yvonne sat side by side on the edge of a sagging, lumpy mattress. They were staring silently at the small, outdated television mounted on the cracked, peeling wall. The live news broadcast from the brownstone illuminated their hollowed-out, exhausted faces. My mother pulled her thin, frayed cardigan tightly around her shaking shoulders. Her eyes were red and swollen, fixed unblinkingly on the screen. She watched as I confidently cut the red ribbon. She saw the sleek, expensive interior of the house she used to rule with an iron fist. She saw the beautiful, capable single mothers carrying their happy children across the threshold. The devastating reality of her monumental failure crashed down upon her all over again. My father sat completely paralyzed, his hands resting limply on his knees. He listened to my interview, absorbing every single word I said about false legacies and exclusionary superiority. He looked around the dismal, depressing motel room that was now their permanent reality. There were no country club friends calling to check on them. There were no luxury cars parked outside. Tasha was working double shifts at a local diner just to afford basic groceries, completely cut off from the wealthy lifestyle she had violently sacrificed her own sister to maintain. Bradley was sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting a lengthy prison sentence for massive wire fraud. DeAndre and Yvonne had absolutely nothing left. Their previous life of endless luxury, prestigious social events, and unearned superiority was gone forever. They had traded their entire kingdom, their dignity, and their flesh and blood for an arrogant, racist illusion. Now they were forced to sit in squalor and watch the daughter they had ruthlessly discarded become a highly celebrated, massively powerful titan of industry. The heavy burden of their guilt would forever haunt their every waking moment, serving as a constant punishment. The historic brownstone that had once been the ultimate symbol of their exclusionary pride was now a brilliant, thriving monument to my absolute triumph. They realized with agonizing, inescapable clarity that their names had been completely erased from the city's history. No one in this city would ever remember their pathetic existence. The legacy they had so fiercely and foolishly tried to protect had been entirely rewritten by the very woman they had deemed unworthy of a simple meal. The ultimate justice was finally absolute. They watched the television screen fade to a commercial break, leaving them alone in the suffocating silence of their own devastating, irreversible ruin. I let the thought of their suffocating silence fade from my mind completely as I stepped out of the black town car and looked up at the familiar, elegant awning of Le Petit. It had been exactly 6 months since the horrific birthday dinner that irrevocably altered the trajectory of my entire family. Tonight, the crisp evening air felt entirely different. There was no anxiety tightening my chest, no dread pooling in my stomach at the prospect of enduring my parents' thinly veiled insults or Tasha's blatant cruelty. Tonight, I was simply a mother taking her incredibly bright, wonderful son out for a well-deserved celebration. I held Malik's hand as we walked through the heavy glass doors of the Michelin-starred restaurant. The warm, ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers immediately washed over us, accompanied by the soft, sophisticated hum of polite conversation and clinking silverware. We did not have to wait in the crowded reception area for a hostess to verify our reservation. Antoine, the regional general manager, spotted us the absolute second we crossed the threshold. He immediately abandoned his post at the front desk and walked briskly toward us with a wide, genuine smile stretching across his face. He bowed his head respectfully, greeting me not just as a high-paying customer, but as a highly valued, respected patron of his establishment. He led us past the busy main dining floor, bypassing the standard seating entirely. He guided us towards the absolute best table in the entire restaurant, a secluded, luxurious booth situated right beside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering downtown Chicago skyline. The table was dressed in pristine white linen, adorned with a modest but beautiful arrangement of fresh white orchids. Malik slid into the plush leather booth, his eyes wide with excitement as he looked out at the city lights. He was wearing a brand new tailored blazer that fit him perfectly, looking every bit the young, confident gentleman I was raising him to be. He did not look like a child waiting to be marginalized or punished for simply existing. He looked like he entirely belonged here, and that realization filled my heart with an overwhelming, profound sense of maternal pride. Antoine personally unfolded our napkins and placed them gently on our laps. He did not bother handing us the standard leather-bound menus. He already knew exactly what we were here to celebrate and exactly what we desired. He simply asked if we preferred sparkling or still water, then poured 2 glasses of imported mineral water with practiced flawless elegance. I watched Malik look around the private booth, his posture relaxed and happy. There were no dry, cold bread baskets shoved aggressively toward his water glass tonight. There were no arrogant racist relatives threatening our housing security or mocking our lifestyle. We were completely surrounded by an impenetrable fortress of peace, safety, and undeniable respect. Within 20 minutes, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open. Antoine returned, followed closely by the executive chef of Le Petit. They approached our table carrying massive gleaming silver trays. The rich, mouth-watering aroma of roasted garlic, rosemary, and perfectly seared meat instantly filled our private alcove. The chef smiled warmly at Malik before carefully lowering a massive bone-in Wagyu tomahawk steak directly onto the table in front of him. The steak was a masterpiece, sizzling loudly on a heated cast-iron platter, accompanied by a side of rich, creamy truffle mac and cheese and beautifully glazed asparagus. Antoine placed an identical, perfectly cooked steak in front of me. Malik's face lit up with absolute, unadulterated joy. He looked down at the magnificent meal, then looked up at me, his dark eyes shining with pure gratitude. There was no confusion, no fear of rejection, and absolutely no feeling of being less than anyone else in the room. He picked up his fork and knife, expertly cutting into the tender premium beef without a single ounce of hesitation. I watched him take his first bite, a massive grin spreading across his face as he chewed. He gave me a happy, enthusiastic thumbs up. I felt a warm, healing tear prick the corner of my eye, but it was a tear of absolute triumph, not sorrow. I signaled Antoine one final time. He immediately returned with a silver ice bucket containing a bottle of premium sparkling apple cider. He expertly popped the cork and poured the bubbling golden liquid into 2 tall crystal champagne flutes. I picked up my glass and held it out toward the center of the table. Malik quickly wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, picked up his own crystal flute, and carefully clinked the rim against mine. The sweet, clear sound rang beautifully in the quiet booth. I looked deeply into my son's eyes, seeing the bright, limitless future stretching out before him. I had successfully severed the generational trauma that had poisoned my family tree. I had permanently removed the toxic, abusive individuals who sought to diminish our light. I had built a towering, untouchable empire entirely on my own terms, ensuring that my son would never ever have to beg for a seat at anyone else's table. We owned the table now. I took a slow, refreshing sip of the sparkling cider, letting the cool, sweet liquid wash over my tongue. I looked out the window at the beautiful, glowing city of Chicago, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. The legacy of my past was officially dead and buried. The beautiful, untouchable life I had carved out for the two of us was just beginning. This was the exact reality we always deserved. We were finally safe, abundantly wealthy, and completely free from their devastating judgment. Our brilliant story was no longer a tragedy written by bitter people. It was a spectacular, gorgeous victory that we would proudly celebrate for the rest of our beautiful, unburdened days, living in absolute, perfect, and enduring peace.